Hey, welcome back. Thanks for joining us for this post-event discussion. We're going to dive right in with our special guest. Dr. Lindsay Usher's research focuses on coastal recreation and tourism with a particular focus on surf culture. Her projects have been based in Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and the US. She also worked as an ecotourism facilitator while serving as a Peace Corps volunteer in Guatemala. Lindsay, thanks so much for being with us tonight. Eating Up Easter shows us how connected we are, even to one of the most remote islands in the world. Could you share some of your insights on the film and your own reflections?
Sure, I'd be glad to. One of the things that I'd like to start with is actually doing a land acknowledgement. And a land acknowledgement is a way we can raise awareness of Indigenous presence and land rights in our own area. So what I'm going to do is actually share my screen with everyone so that you can see the Indigenous territories that are in the WHRO listening and viewing area. So if you can see on this map, we actually have a number of Indigenous territories that we're all on and in. And so it's important to see that, while we may think of Indigenous people as, people who are maybe in the western part of the US or people who are in a different country, that, actually we're on their land. And that many of them are still around and still thriving. So that's just something that I want to acknowledge off the bat, because this film really centers indigeneity and comes from an Indigenous perspective. Right. The next thing that I wanted to mention was, and this kind of continues on that first theme, is that I just thought this was a really beautiful film, and one of the really neat things about it is that it's made by a Rapa Nui filmmaker. So for years, Indigenous people have been portrayed by non-Indigenous people on screen, or had their stories told by non-Indigenous filmmakers. So being able to tell your own story can be very empowering when you belong to a marginalized population. Sergio talks about this when he talks about the debate amongst scholars with what happened on Rapa Nui with deforestation and the Indigenous people's way of life. Through this film, he's able to show that the Rapa Nui have adapted to the circumstances over the centuries and that they're still thriving today, which contrasts with other narratives that scholars have put out there. So another thing I want to discuss is that, unfortunately, the problems that we see in this documentary are not unique to Rapa Nui. Many people in the global south, or what you might know of as economically developing countries, struggle with the management of tourism. For many of them, it's become a necessity, but it comes at a price, which includes economic issues, environmental problems such as the trash, social change, and the commodification of culture. Now, when I say commodification of culture, what I mean is basically the selling of cultural practices. So we can see this in the film where the couple is debating, well, should we, provide performances and have tourists pay so that we can fund our school? They're really debating, but then they see that, that is really selling their culture, and culture changes once you put a price on it. Before, traditions may have, and ceremonies, had special meaning for that particular group. But once you charge people to come look at it, it has a whole new meaning. And so that commodification of culture can be really tricky to do and very problematic. And many groups all over the world struggle with that. However, fortunately for Rapa Nui, one of the most important things that has happened was the treaty that gave ownership to the land to the Rapa Nui people. That is huge, because for many people, they don't have that option. Many global South countries have been forced to liberalize their economies to pay back debt to the World Bank, which basically means anyone can buy and own property there. So what happens a lot of times is that foreigners come and reap the benefits of tourism, and the Indigenous community misses out. By owning the land, the Rapa Nui can exercise a great degree of control over the development of tourism. Another thing I want to point out is the issues surrounding colonization. So you might think of colonization as something that happened in the 1500s or 1600s, right? But that's actually not the case. For much of Latin America, you can think of colonization in three waves, if you will. So the first wave is the conquistadors, Christopher Columbus and others who came to claim the continent for the land, the resources, and the people. This type of empire building actually continues to this day, including by countries like the United States, in terms of grabbing resources and trying to get that from global South countries. The second wave, which is not completely separate from the first, is religious. And that's where missionaries came to sort of save the indigenous people. And that is honestly still going on today as well. You see a lot of missionary activity in global South countries. Lastly, we can think of tourism as sort of the third wave. Foreigners came into Latin America and set up tourism businesses, and they profit by showing the country to other foreigners. And so there again, you know, sort of using those resources for their own financial gain. And unfortunately, a lot of local residents and indigenous people are forced into low-wage jobs and have no control over the level of tourism development. So that can be really problematic. So having control over that land is really huge for the Rapa Nui, and that gives them a lot of power. The last thing I want to mention, because you're probably thinking that this is the elephant in the room, is COVID-19. And I actually see a lot of parallels between the decisions the Rapa Nui are facing and the decisions that many communities are having to make right now. However, instead of trash and cultural change, tourists are bringing a virus. And with many communities' dependence on tourism, they're being forced to let the tourists in to survive economically, much like on Rapa Nui. Now, health is something else destinations have to manage on top of the environmental and cultural issues that tourism brings. And so those are really my final thoughts on that. I hope you have, I hope I've managed to answer your questions if you put any in the chat box. And I hope you enjoyed the film as much as I did.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. Thank you again for being here. I know you're busy with your higher education and tourism life. I know you have a lot going on, so we really appreciate you lending your insights and expertise to this. Eating Up Easter and other Independent Lens films can be seen on WHRO's Passport. Members can access these films and many other popular PBS programs on the go or at home. If you'd like more information on the Emerging Leaders Board or WHRO public media programming, please visit whro.org. We hope to see you guys soon. Stay healthy, stay safe, and good night.